Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis. This announcement is for AMH 1020 here at SCF. This week we are going to be examining the Cold War. Our reading this week pertains to the origin of the Cold War following the end of World War II. We also have our second test this week, so make sure that you prepare for that. I've got a study guide up for you. The second test is just like the first test, so you'll have a few of those short essay questions like we did in the first one. You'll have some multiple choice types of questions as well. The test relates to the material from this section, so it's not like you have to go back to the beginning of the class. It only pertains to information covered since the last test. So go back and review material from the last test. Be watching my presentations, my lectures that I have every week. Hopefully everybody's been watching those, and if you need, go back and review those. Remember, use the study guide. I base the test on the study guide, so use that study guide to sort of guide your preparation for the test. And I'd recommend that you prepare during the week and then take the test on the weekend, and that way you know you'll be as prepared as you possibly can. So this week we have our second test, and we are reading on the origin of the Cold War. So the Cold War is, personally, it's my favorite subject of history. My specialty as a historian is in the history of U.S. international relations during the Cold War. I actually wrote my first book was actually on the Cold War. The title is Reagan's War on Terrorism in Nicaragua. So it was about U.S. interventions in Central America during the late Cold War in the 1980s. And the Cold War is generally a term that refers to a sort of standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. Two superpowers, the only remaining superpowers at the end of the Second World War. And these two major superpowers very much faced off for almost half a century. And it involved huge militarization, tremendous nuclear arms buildup, the creation of huge, large standing armies, and an incredible growth of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies to influence the developing world. It's called the Cold War because technically the United States and the Soviet Union were never shooting at each other. We never went to war directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was never an actual fighting war between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, that term can be somewhat misleading because during the Cold War there were actually a tremendous amount of conflicts that the United States and the Soviet Union became involved in, both directly and indirectly. And those conflicts generally dominated the developing world, the world of the Southern Hemisphere, places like Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America became areas where there were some very intense and long-running conflicts fought in the context of the Cold War. For the United States, of course, the most infamous example of those is the Vietnam War, which we will be looking at in greater depth next week. This was a war that was fought far off in the jungles of Vietnam, also of Laos and Cambodia. It was fought for the so-called containment policy. The United States, believed that it had to contain the expansion of Soviet-influenced communism if it was to protect its own national security and its own interests as a world power. And so the United States had created this containment policy in the late 40s, and over time it became accepted by American policymakers that the United States had to contain communism really in any part of the world. The idea being that if you didn't stop communism at any one point, that the result might be a widespread sort of toppling of dominoes, the so-called domino theory, and we could lose whole regions of the world to the forces of communism. And communism was an anti-capitalist, generally undemocratic ideology that was seen as very incompatible with the United States' perspective, which was very capitalist, centered around free trade, and ideally, at least, around democratic institutions, though the United States, of course, supported many non-democratic entities in its attempt to contain communism. In Vietnam, for example, we supported a government in South Vietnam that was anything but democratic. It was an autocratic, really non-representative state, but we valued supporting that state over the interest of potential communist expansion. So the Cold War is called the Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union don't fight directly, but the United States and the Soviet Union very much vied for power in the developing world, and there were many bloody, long-running wars that were fought in the developing world in the interest of the United States, for example, containing communism, and vice versa for the Soviet Union. Both were interested in sort of establishing their influence in various areas of the developing world, because much of the developing world now was coming out of colonization. They were gaining independence after the end of World War II, because all of the great empires, the British and the French Empire, had all collapsed. And so now there was sort of a rush to compete for a lot of the influence in a lot of these areas, as these areas began to vie for their independence, and both sides wanted to take a stake and influence in these areas. And so the Soviet Union sought to expand and advance its interest by supporting governments and revolutionaries in the developing world, and as did the United States. There are many, many legacies of the Cold War, and we'll talk more about these in coming weeks as we deal with the Cold War for the next several weeks. And of course, Vietnam is one of the biggest examples for the United States, but there are numerous examples of how the Cold War has shaped our world today. So it's a area of history that very much interests me. And I could go on and on and on. You can probably kind of get that feel. But watch my lecture. I have a recorded lecture for you. So go ahead and watch that lecture, and it should help you further understand this beyond what we're reading this week. So our factoid for this week is this. Remember, email me that factoid no later than by Wednesday night. I'm tabulating everybody's emails. You get 1 free point added to one of your tests at the end of the term. So it's a great deal. You get to actually at the end of the term, if you do all of them, it'll bump your final score up by 3 or 4 points, your total final score. So it's a pretty good deal, actually. This is the factoid. With the development of the Cold War, we really see the emergence in the modern sense of the modern UFO craze. And this is probably related most to the new types of aerospace development that's going on during the Cold War, from the development of high-altitude planes like the U-2 spy plane, the SR-71 Blackbird, other experimental projects, high-altitude weather balloons, all these types of things, which were very much in earnest during the Cold War. So with the advent of the Cold War and the growth of this tremendous, in the United States, military-industrial complex, the United States created a massive standing army during peacetime, which was a very new thing for the United States. And we dumped a lot of money and a lot of research into developing our military technology. And as a result of this, or at least we might surmise that much of this phenomenon was as a result of this, though there are some still unexplained aspects of this. But as a result of this intense competition of the Cold War, we see in the late 40s and the 50s and the 60s the emergence of the UFO craze. And the UFO craze embodies, pop culture on many, many levels during this period. And one of the biggest reasons was because, and this is the factoid, in 1947, there was a UFO that crashed in the desert in Roswell near an American air base. Roswell, New Mexico. And the reason I say it was a UFO is not to say that it was like an alien spacecraft necessarily, though there are people that insist that that was the case to this day. But the reason I say that is because that's what the official news report initially said. So there was this. The government today says that it was a crashed weather balloon, that it was a high-altitude weather balloon. It was called Project Mogul, and these are these really high-tech silver weather balloons that they were using high up in the atmosphere. And they said one crashed, and it was misidentified as a flying saucer, if you will. That's the official line today. There are some that insist to this day that it was actually a UFO of extraterrestrial origin. However, the initial news reports in 1947, the initial news story was that the United States military had recovered a crashed UFO. And then later that story was sort of pulled a few days later, and it was amended. But as a result of that, that crash has since been the center of conspiracy theories. Roswell, New Mexico has a whole tourism industry centered around the idea of aliens and UFOs, and it really was probably the most significant kickstart to the UFO craze, which begins in the early Cold War, which of course has later been announced by the U.S. government that this was a high-altitude weather balloon that crashed. But still to this day, conspiracy theorists will cite the fact that the first report was that it was a UFO, and there's been numerous types of conspiracy details that have leaked out or have been suggested to have leaked out since then. So it remains something that is sort of like a holy grail for UFO enthusiasts, though most would suggest that it's almost certainly related to some aspect of the world, the terrestrial world, and the competition during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Anyway, guys, I hope it's interesting, and let's have a great week. Email me if you have any questions. I'm sorry the announcement got a little long. Let's have a great week.